Welcome to lecture number 6. This lecture is dealing with the financing of the transformation and the role of global carbon markets. My name is Renate Schubert. I'm an economist by training, and I am a professor for economics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. I'm heading there the Institute for Environmental Decisions. Today's lecture number 6, as I told you, is talking about the transformation, and we have 2 episodes. Episode number 1, which you can already see here, is on investment requirements, financing options, and investment barriers. And then we have an episode number 2, which will be given by my colleague Daniel Klingenfeld, and this is dealing with the role of global carbon markets. And as you all know, as a third episode, we will then have an interview together with Daniel on some questions concerning these financing issues. Which are the learning outcomes for lecture number 6? Well, there are 6 key learning outcomes which we would like to promote. The first, of course, is that you get an idea of the size and structure of investment requirements for the global transformation, and especially for the energy transformation. The second key outcome should be that you know about the advantages of the energy transformation. Then we have a third outcome, and this is that you know the basic options and actors for financing the energy transformation, and at the same time that you know and understand the barriers for financing global energy transformation. There are specific barriers in developing countries, and this is our outcome number 5. We would like you to know more about that. And finally, outcome number 6 should be that you are aware of solutions for overcoming the financing and investment barriers. Now, let us see what the content of this first episode is. There's a first part concerning investment requirements and advantages of the energy transformation. Then we will have a second part concerning the financing itself and the barriers and the solutions, and of course a conclusion at the end. Let me start with the investment requirements. The global transformation requires, above all, investments into the things which I wrote on that slide, and this is number 1, research and development of new technologies, so-called R&D. Then what we need is the diffusion of technologies. We also need energy-efficient agricultural and industrial production techniques. We have to have more communication or better evolved communication and transport systems. And I wrote it in bold because this is in the key focus of this lecture, we have to have investments in the expansion of renewable energy production, into energy grids, and into the energy storage capacities. And in addition, we have to have more investments into the end-use efficiency, like mobility, housing, or communication. Let us now come to numbers, the investment requirements for the energy transformation. We have a global amount on energy-related investments that we already have today as in the year 2010. In that year, we had 1.3 trillion of US dollars per year that were invested on a global level into energy-related investments. Now, what do we need in the future? The future investments have to be about nearly a double of these 1.3 trillion. We need 2 trillion US dollar per year in the year 2030, and even 3.5 trillion US dollar per year in the year 2050. If you scale that up, you end with an amount of about 68 trillion in total in US dollars between those years 2010 and 2050. It's interesting to see that the investment requirements differ between different regions and sections. Let's start here with the regions. For North America, the European Union, and China, we will have about 60% of the total investment requirements up to the year 2030. What's very interesting is to see that we will have a shift of the investment requirements to the newly industrializing countries by 2030. And if you look in the table, you see that North America and the European Union will have a certain decline in the investment requirements, whereas China's investment requirements will go up until the year 2030. If you have a specific look into the developing countries, then you see that they will have an annual requirement of between 260 and 580 billion US dollar per year until the year 2030. Now let's have a look on the sector requirements. You have this graph, which you can see here, and you see that the highest share of investments is needed in the transport sector. This is the green columns, and in addition for the commercial and residential sector, and here especially for buildings within the sector. This is the pink and the violet columns, which you see on top. Now, let's come now to the societal benefits of the energy transformation. There are many societal benefits of that energy transformation, you can say, and I just listed some of the most important ones. It's a key issue, a key societal benefit, that more people have access to modern energy services. This is a problem specifically interesting for developing countries, and if you have the energy transformation, more than 3 billion people will be able to have access to modern energy services. In addition, you will be able to have fuel savings. You need less fossil fuels. You will have reduced costs for air pollution control due to the reduced use of fossil fuels. And also related to that, you will have reduced health and environment-related expenditures because there are fewer problems in that sector. In addition, if you use less fossil fuels, you will have reduced climate change adaptation costs. And in addition, increased energy security and independence from fuel imports. So this is another important societal benefit of the energy transformation. And last but not least, the development of innovations and new sectors, which might also give new employment opportunities, is a final important societal benefit which I would like to mention here. Now, if you take these benefits into account and reflect them with the costs, then you can say something about the advantages of the energy transformation as a whole. And you can say that there are two key aspects. One is that because of the societal benefits, the so-called net costs of the energy transformation are much lower than the gross costs. That means the investment amounts you have to undertake right now. And second advantage, due to the operating cost savings from reduced fossil or nuclear energy systems, the investment costs of the energy transformation with more renewable energy and higher energy efficiency can be paid back until the year 2040. So you can conclude at this step that it seems worthwhile financing the global energy transformation and especially the decarbonization of global energy systems. Now let's come to the second part of this lecture. This is the financing requirements themselves and the financing options and barriers and solutions. We start with the financing options and actors. We have a little table here where you find the parties that are supplying capital, the so-called capital investors. And you see that governments play a role here, that venture capitalists play a role. You have the private equity providers, and you have a lot of other like retail investors, smaller households, and international and institutional investors that bring capital to the market that could be used in order to finance the energy transformation. On the other hand, and this is the middle column of that table, you have the investors themselves. That means the parties that are seeking capital in order to realize the investments. And this again is the governments. And of course, many private companies like industry, utilities, or energy project developers. You have the network operators that are seeking capital, and of course, private households, especially if you think of energy efficiency investments. And the third column then shows you the intermediaries that you need in order to bring the capital that comes to the capital market to the investors that are seeking the capital. Now, which resources do the different actors have? That means the question is now, we heard about the between 2 and 3.5 trillion per year that we need in order to cope with the investment requirements. And the question now is, do we have enough capital around in order to meet these requirements? Let's have a look on the different actors. The governments, their estimated financial assets are about 18.7 trillion US dollar. That means already enough, you could say, but we will see in a minute that there are other sources that are even more richer. Then we have potential new sources within the governments. There could be new tax revenues. There could be revenues, for instance, from emission trading. There could be savings from phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and so on. So these 18.7 trillions is just what we have right now, but it may be augmented and be more in the future. The biggest part of resources coming from financing actors comes from the private companies and households. If you look at their estimated financial assets, you arrive at a number of nearly 180 trillion US dollar. And if you compare this number even with the accumulated investment requirements that was about 70 trillion US dollar for the phase between 2010 and 2050, then you see that it's clear that there is enough capital around. In addition, we also have the international financing organizations and the climate and development finance. Here we have an estimated spending on energy projects of a bit below 10 billion US dollar per year. And what's also interesting to have in mind is that we have a nice leverage ratio here. That means if international financing organizations give a certain amount of money, then private actors give a lot more of money. And you have ratios between 3 to 1, 3, for instance, billions or millions of a private investor as compared to 1 million invested by an international financing organization. And the figures go even up until 15 to 1. Now that we are at the point that we see we have enough capital to meet the investment requirements, we see on the other hand that there seem to be some barriers so that the investments which we need are not financed until now. And the question is therefore, which are the main barriers to the investment financing? And a key barrier seems to be the risk-return ratio. You find here a little graph which maps the risks of investments and their expected returns. And you see that you can also have all sorts of investments, those with low risk and low returns. You can have investments with high risks and high expected returns. And it turns out that the investments into renewable energies and energy efficiency, that they are characterized as being investments that have high risk on the one hand and low returns on the other hand. And that means, as you can see from the blue dot down, that these investments do not really qualify for de facto investments. They seem not to be attractive enough for the investors, and that means when we will talk later about solutions, what we have to have in mind is to find measures in order to bring down the risks and to bring up the returns. Now, which are the barriers? We have general barriers in the overall policy framework. And the first thing I want to mention here is the lack of stringent, long-term and legally binding energy and climate policies. There are only few countries where some policies have been already started. I will mention that later on. Investors need transparency, longevity and certainty, especially the protection of trust, the protection of continuance. And we can say that without stringent and binding energy and climate policies, the investment risks will always remain too high so that it's not plausible that we will have enough investments. Still, at the level of the overall policy framework, we have two more barriers that should be mentioned. One is the externalization of societal costs of fossil fuels and nuclear energies. We have societal costs of CO2 emissions and of nuclear accidents that are not included in the prices of fossil fuels or nuclear energy. And therefore, these energy sources are too cheap, and this also gives a disadvantage to renewable energy and to energy efficiency. Furthermore, fossil and also nuclear fuels are subsidized today. We have around $410 billion of demand-side subsidies for fossil fuels in 2010. And if you take that all together, you can say as long as the energy prices for fossil fuels and nuclear energy are too low, the returns of renewable energy investments will remain too low, will therefore hinder investments in that area, and the attractiveness of energy efficiency investments is also too low. Then we have additional barriers. On the one side, specific barriers for energy investments. Which are these barriers? Well, we have high upfront capital requirements and long payback periods. Capital requirements are high for these investments in in renewable energy and energy investments, and the capital is typically locked in for over 10 years, often until 40 years, and this goes far beyond the investment horizon of many investors. Another barrier consists in high technology risks. Renewable energies and energy efficiency technologies are often new, and they have to be tested for some period in order to bring the risks down. We have high resource risks. For instance, if you think of solar energy or wind energy, sunshine and wind show high fluctuations, and this gives a resource risk to this type of energy. Then we have further high market risks. The development of the prices of energy and the market demand for energy is uncertain, and this is an additional risk for investments in our energy transformation. And a final point I would like to mention is high transaction costs. Often projects are low scale, and since they are low scale, they nevertheless require huge efforts for the collection of data, for due diligence, and for administrative procedures. That all results in relatively low returns on these investments. We have, in addition, specific barriers for investments in grids and energy efficiency. Let's look at the existing grid regulations. What you see there is that the grids, which are natural monopolies, that require government regulations, there you find that the existing regulations do not allow for passing on investment costs to the users and to network charges. And that means that the incentives for grid expansion are really low. In addition, we have information asymmetries in the sense that investors know typically more about the potential energy savings than the capital suppliers. And therefore, there is a trend that capital suppliers may not trust in energy saving potentials. And furthermore, there are inappropriate institutional structures. Let me give you an example. Landlords typically have to pay for energy efficiency measures in buildings, but the tenants profit from the day-to-day energy savings. And this, of course, gives a low incentive for the landlords to make an energy efficiency investment. Now, let's have a look on specific barriers for the developing countries. What you find here is on the one side that all barriers about which I spoke are also relevant in the developing countries. But we have some more in addition that are not so relevant for the industrialized countries. Which are these specific developing country barriers? First barrier is the lack of political and economic preconditions for foreign direct investments. Often, investors expect political stability and legal certainty and a functioning financial and banking sector, and that is often not to be found in developing countries. then what we observe in developing countries is that the scale of the renewable energy and energy efficiency projects is even lower than we observe it in industrialized countries. And this causes the effect that we have prohibitively high transformation costs and therefore low investment incentives. A third point relevant for developing countries is that we are lacking solvent electricity customers. Many households cannot afford a regular power supply, and therefore if the payments to the energy investors or electricity investors, the grid investors, are uncertain or very improbable, there are low investment incentives. And a final point to be made is that we have limited funds from development and climate finance. There are only very small shares that go to transformative renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. That means we also have the problem of lacking finances in developing countries. Now that we have set all the problems which we face and the investment barriers, we can continue with a look on solutions and recommendations for financing the energy transformation. We can classify the recommendations, as you can see on that slide here. On the one hand, and that's on the top of that graph, we have changes in the overall political framework. Then we have two other sorts of recommendations. One is modifying the conditions and regulation of the energy markets, and the second is modifying the conditions and regulation of the capital markets. And finally, what should not be forgotten is the scaling up of international cooperation. Let me go into detail now for these various types of recommendations. Let's start with the overall policy framework. What we need in order to bring the risks down, the risks for energy transformation investments, is first defining long-term reliable energy strategies. And as I already said, there are some endeavors like in countries like Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and the UK, but these are rather exceptions today, and many countries still do not have these reliable energy strategies. A second point to bring the risks of energy transformation investment down is the guaranteeing of legal security to investors so that they can be sure that that their investments can pay off over time. And there are two other important points that may bring the returns up of investments in the energy transformation. One is, if you internalize the societal costs of fossil fuels and nuclear energy, for instance, by putting a price on CO2 emissions or by increasing the liability of nuclear power plant owners. And another aspect, how you could bring up the returns, if you are looking at the overall policy framework, is to abandon the fossil fuel subsidies, to phase out all demand and supply side fossil fuel subsidies. Now let's come to recommendations for reducing investment barriers in the energy markets. Here we have two measures that at the same time bring the risks down and the returns up. This is first promoting promoting investments in renewable energies through feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs are already in practice in several countries, and of course it is necessary to have them only for a specific time. That means we need temporary feed-in tariffs for renewable energies. And what we also need is guaranteed returns so that the new technology diffusion is supported. Another measure that brings returns up and risks down is to allow the market integration of renewable energy. That means you need to improve the electricity market design in order to bring renewable energies into the conventional electricity markets. And you could do that by way of temporary market premium, so that after some time they will be phased out. But just right now, if you are starting with this endeavor, you should give a specific premium to the integration of this renewable energy. Then we have, if you're looking on the energy markets, another measure that's important, that is directed towards bringing up the returns. And this is to set incentives for grid expansion. We need an expansion of the grids in order to bring the energy transformation through. And that means we need to allow increased network charges. Only if this is the case, we will have more investments in energy transformation. Then we have a second slide here on recommendations for reducing investment barriers in energy markets. Two measures that could bring the risks down, the risks of investments in energy transformation. One is creating dynamic efficiency standards. If you think, for instance, of the top runner approaches, which you have in several countries, to take always the efficiency of the best product in a class as an overall industry standard, you can have additional energy efficiency investments. And in the same line, promoting research and development is also important, not only for energy efficiency, but also for renewable energy technologies. You need more research and more development for energy storing technologies, so that households' energy demand can be reduced. Let's look now on the capital markets. Here we have also two slides that contain the recommendations for reducing the investment barriers here. On the first slide, you find one recommendation, that is setting up national development banks, or so-called green investment banks. Why is that important? Well, these banks could first give information, for instance, consulting services, database for capital investments, so that they have a better basis for making their investment decisions. Second, they could give capital at preferential conditions. That means they could give preferential credits or credit lines. And third aspect of these green investment banks is that they offer further risk mitigation options, for instance, like funds in private partnerships, credit guarantees, energy-saving insurances, weather derivatives, and so on. We have a second slide concerning recommendations for reducing investment barriers in capital markets. And here you find three more recommendations. One is to adapt the financial market regulation. What we need to do is to reduce the disadvantages for long-term investments in accounting standards. And we also need aligning management and compensation schemes to long-term goals. This is not the case right now. Right now, short-term goals are in the forefront, and what we need to do is really to put more emphasis on the long-term goals. This brings risks down and returns up. In addition, we should try to support venture capital markets. That means you should create favorable fiscal conditions for transformative energy-related venture capital funds. This, of course, brings the risks for such investments in energy transformation down. And in addition, final point here is we need to support new business models. And one example I would like to give you is the so-called energy services companies, the so-called ESCOs, which do some sort of energy contracting. That means you do not, as a household, for instance, need to buy the total equipment for your energy supply, but you just buy energy services from these ESCOs, so that you have a much smaller investment amount that is needed. And a second interesting model that already can be observed at some instances is the citizens' energy cooperatives. There are other models around, and all these models bring the risks of future energy transformation investments down, and therefore should be supported. There are specific investment barriers in developing countries. We spoke about that, and there are, of course, then some recommendations tackling this issue. What developing countries need, in addition to what I already said about the other recommendations, is market facilitation organizations. That means institutions that reduce the transaction costs for investors when they are bringing their products to the market. We need the support of strategic energy partnerships between industrialized countries and developing countries. And let's not forget the newly industrialized countries that could also be an interesting partner in these partnerships. What developing countries also need is the enhancement or the enhancement of the access to capital. We need to scale up risk management tools for international financing organizations, like, for instance, the International Financing Corporation, the IFC, or also the MIGA. This brings the risks down, the risks which investors in energy transformation are facing. And the final point that should be mentioned is we need to strengthen the international organizations, mainly in coordinating the global energy transformation. And what I would like to mention is that an institution like the UN Energy or the International Renewable Energy Agency, the IRENA, they should be fostered on one side and they should better cooperate on the other side in order to improve the returns of, for investors in energy transformation. Okay, let me come now to the conclusions. If we look back what we heard, then we can say the global energy transformation has to be financed and it can be financed. There are huge investment requirements for a global energy transformation. You remember the figures were something between 2 and 3.5 billion US dollar per year. But on the other hand, we saw that there seems to be enough private capital available for financing these requirements. We also saw that there are investment and financing barriers that make the transformation slow and slower than we needed in order to, for instance, cope with climate change problems. And therefore, the overall policy framework, as well as energy and capital market conditions, have to be adjusted so that the risk-return ratio of investments into the global energy transformation becomes attractive and more attractive than it is today. And it should become attractive in industrialized, emerging, and also developing economies. Now, let me draw your attention finally to some exercises for your self-study. I brought with me 3 questions. I don't want to read them now, but you can see them and you can answer them, and they try to give you the opportunity of repeating a bit of the key points about which I spoke. And finally, I would like to draw your attention to the references which we have here. You have, of course, the basic report of the WBGU, and we indicated a lot of further readings. So if you are interested, you could continue with these books and articles. Thank you.